Hello, everybody, and welcome to our conversation here on sustainability in manufacturing. I'm excited to be a part of this Techstars Manufacturing Summit and get a chance to talk about changes that are happening across the manufacturing world to help make building things more sustainable and able to use materials and processes that are long-term friendly to our planet and to ourselves. I'm Cody Simms. I'm the Senior Vice President of Climate and Sustainability at Techstars, and joined here by Danielle Joseph and Dan Fitzgerald. Why don't the two of you introduce yourselves really quickly? Let's see. Let's start with Dan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dan Fitzgerald. I work for Stanley Black Decker, and I'm a product sustainability director. And within that role, we're focused on developing new products with sustainability as an inspiration, as well as improving the impact of our current portfolio through circular design, sustainable supply chain, and other methods. So those two things combined form our product sustainability strategy. So I'm happy to be here to discuss sustainability in manufacturing.
Great. And my name is Danielle Joseph. I'm an executive director at Closed Loop Partners. I lead our Closed Loop Ventures group practice, so all of the early stage investing activities at Closed Loop Partners, which is an investment firm and advisory services business focused specifically on the circular economy. So we overlay into the manufacturing sector in the sense of how do we reduce waste in supply chains and recapture materials that are currently being wasted.
Well, I'm excited to have Dan and Danielle here in that we've got Dan's running a very large supply chain in terms of how it relates to sustainability. And then Danielle, of course, working with hundreds of startups across the world as they try to make Dan's life easier. So it should be a good complement. You know, as I think many of you know, I mean, the industrial sector today is responsible for roughly 30% of direct global greenhouse gas emissions. 5% of that are through things like cement and chemicals, 7% from iron and steel, 4% in petrochemicals. And this doesn't even take into account the transportation footprint of goods as they move across supply chains. So, it's a huge problem as we talk about trying to decarbonize our emissions. Most of you know that overall decarbonization goals are to decarbonize our emissions by 50% over the next 9 years now, by the year 2030. To stay in line with the Paris Agreement. But of course, sustainability in manufacturing is more than even just decarbonization. It includes a broad range of circular technologies. And so what I'm going to start with is a rapid fire set of questions to Dan and Danielle just to warm us up. And then we'll move into more of a conversation and encourage questions from you all as well. We want to make this as open and sort of dialogue driven as possible. But to start with the lightning round questions. So given what I just said about emissions reductions targets, here's a true or false question for you. The main driver of interest in circularity use cases today is emissions reductions. True or false?
Do you want us to give thumbs up or thumbs down?
Just answer. Just shout it out.
I'll say false from the investment perspective. I think there's a lot of talk and a lot of folks who have emissions targets as part of their corporate strategies, for example. But what's actually driving the purchasing decisions, at least what we see, are true cost savings or efficiency operational advantages.
All right. And not to give a Snopes answer, but I'll say partially true. The other big side being material scarcity. And we're currently going through a material scarce time right now on a lot of different components, right, because of COVID. So, if you've got a circular system, recapturing those for the next round of products, then, your scarcity, you're less subject to the scarcity that it goes with the up and down of commodities.
Awesome. All right. Next one. Which is harder as a startup? One, selling a more sustainable feedstock into an existing manufacturing process, or two, selling a more sustainable process for manufacturing using legacy feedstocks?
Well, from our side, personally, I'd say it's harder to sell the more sustainable material because there are so many different product and life tests associated with that material versus sort of by the time you get maybe a more energy efficient process, by the time you're ready to sell a big piece of equipment, you've done all your homework, right? Versus sort of startups for material, or a lot of born out of like, very early R&D that's piloted. So I would say it's probably harder to sell the material than the process.
That's interesting. I come at it from the opposite side, maybe spending more time with the early stage startups and how long it takes to get to that point, Dan, where they're actually ready to put a piece of equipment in.
Mm-hmm.
I think in getting off the ground, at least from what we see, it seems harder to install a new process as a pilot rather than saying this is a new material, but it fits into your existing infrastructure. So there's no additional CapEx required. That seems to be a easier sell through maybe in the very early days, and how your point is true.
Cool. Interesting. I love it. That's what we're here to uncover, some of the differences. All right. So another question for you is, before a startup hits scale, its products are often going to be produced at a premium relative to the existing scaled materials. And so, what % of premium above production market price do you think is acceptable for a startup when pitching a pilot?
I'll give the vague and unsatisfactory answer here. It really depends on the value of your product and what type of problem it's solving. We've seen early stage companies able to charge really outrageous premiums for their initial product lines, and then other companies that can't get traction with a moderate 20% premium. So it really depends on how integral you are to the value chain.
Yeah, and I think, I can't put an actual number on it, but a suggestion would be that, especially, in our space, which is more durable goods, which is probably a phase behind fast moving consumer goods, which have, really embraced sustainability. And there's a lot of research there taking off. In durable goods, we don't have as much research showing on the back end that, bullet points on sustainability drive additional revenue, right? So really what's working for us in the short term is startups that can come with a sustainable solution that also offers an additional functionality benefit, right? That justifies the premium. So chemical corrosion resistance or strength of impact, right? Other things that are better than what we're currently using that we could show more functionally to the end user. And then the sustainability story is almost the cherry on top. So, but I think though, as more research gets done in different areas, right? And hopefully it shows the revenue bump in durables as well, then that will kind of fade away, and we'll have a better understanding of what sustainability means in terms of value to the end user.
Yeah, awesome. All right, let's see a couple more here on the lightning round. I feel confident that a manufacturing startup that's touting a more sustainable material is ready for production scale once I've seen them execute on blank.
So I honestly can't really answer this because I don't have direct experience with it. Startups, they're great. They can change the material quick. They're very agile. We've never had sort of one go from, all right, you're this big, and then now you're using all of our products, right? How do you scale? So I'm sorry, I just can't answer that directly, but right. I'm sure it's a difficult process.
It's okay. I'll take a stab at this one. So what's really important before you even think about trying to sell your scalability is that you've demonstrated that product market fit. I think there are lots of examples of folks that try to rush into that before really understanding who their customer is and demonstrating that there's some demand to pay for that. So that's really important. And then I think in terms of from the investor perspective, it really depends on who you're talking to. I don't have a technical background. And so in order for me to gain comfort with the scalability of something, it has to make sense to my level of high school chemistry or just kind of the logic of intuition and or the validation of other folks who are maybe smarter in the engineering space than I am. And so that's really important. Ideally, you're looking for less complexity over more in terms of the scale up. And that's why I think the kind of high school chemistry analogy actually makes a lot of sense. If you can explain it to your grandmother, if you can explain it to somebody who doesn't have a lot of expertise, the risk of scaling up is probably going to be a lot less than something that has 5 different moving parts in order for you to get to scale.
Yeah. Okay, 2 more questions here on this section. In the last few months, I've seen a notable influx of startups working on blank.
Software.
Yeah, it's been pretty amazing. I think like even 2 years ago, we saw a lot more companies coming up with harder materials, hardware products in the circular economy space. Now there's an influx of software We've seen a lot in traceable supply chains, inventory management solutions across different industry verticals. We spend a lot of time in kind of plastics and packaging, food and ag, fashion and apparel, and then supply chains inclusive of manufacturing. And we've seen a lot of folks now focusing on traceability and transparency, which is really exciting.
Cool. Dan, any qualifiers to software, or the same stuff that Danielle's seeing?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'm just struggling with it a little bit because it all ultimately relies on an educated supply chain to fill it in. So that's the barrier to get over, right? Not really the system to make it easy to search it. It's getting that good data in it in the first place. So
right.
I think that's what's not being hit by software companies right now is they talk about how cool it is, but at the end of the day, you still need somebody to understand it and input it, right? So
Yep, interesting. Okay, and then finally, I'm currently really excited about startups trying to tackle blank.
Well, this is a good segue. I'm excited about startups that are looking at unique ways to capture data. So things like local air sensors, just local sensors, and then they're collecting this all and basically drawing conclusions from it. Like, oh, this supplier might be out of compliance because we're sensing, and that is really the key, because the roadblock is asking the supplier to do it and either not understanding it or not getting the right data. So if you can bypass that and have some good AI work being able to kind of alert you to risks outside of a direct submission of data, I feel like that would be a pretty powerful and different solution that would be useful.
I completely agree with Dan on this one. We're seeing that what we're calling kind of first mile data integration. Once something's already produced, it's pretty easy to track, let's say, transactions through the supply chain, but how are you getting that really high quality first mile data input? And so sensors and new technologies, even just new business models that incentivize that right quality of data entry are really interesting for us. The other category, I would say, are more distributed manufacturing technologies or solutions that we're looking at.
Super interesting. All right, so let's dive in and have a little bit more of a discussion on these things. And I think that's a good segue. So, as we're talking about remote sensor networks and capturing data out on the edges, I mean, a lot of that leads me to believe that is still heavily on the emissions front, at least today, where a lot of that technology is capturing, if not CO2 emissions, then just other forms of noxious emissions that are going into the air. Is that all part of really the sort of the scope 3 challenge that you think large companies are dealing with today? And is that what's ultimately driving, that phenomenon? Or is there something else at play that is incentivizing your interest in wanting to see more technology there?
So, I think when you look at the basic equation of how you calculate scope 3, if you're a physical product manufacturer, it's weight times emissions factor equals emissions, right? So what do you have to play with in that equation? You use less material, so digitization of products, right? Potentially. Or you use better materials, which have a lower emissions factor, right? And right now, sort of the state of the art is to grab that data from a life cycle database. But that's a global average or regional average, right? If you could get your suppliers to kind of deliver, hey, when it comes through me, this is what your factor is. And then we could say, well, we're only going to pick suppliers that are lower than the average, right? And then that makes you better than the average. And so that's really kind of, I think, what we're looking for that's not there.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'd say, again, I think the scope 3 emissions and really looking at emissions as a criteria is something that we're interested in from an impact perspective, and every investment that we make has to have some kind of direct or enabling impact that allows for emissions reductions. But overall, what we're seeing driving the market and not just the first movers who care about emissions, but also the kind of second and third order customers are not that, are the cost savings and the kind of time efficiencies that are created by, Dan's point, better materials or like a more stable supply of your input streams, right? And so the way that we, one way to think about that and broken down into different sectors is there's optimization in the design space today. How you're actually designing your product for recoverability. That's interesting and enabling. There's the input materials that you're actually using. How are you using new material types, recycled materials, the more efficient processes. So whether that's reducing waste in the supply chain itself, in your production process, using more localized manufacturing, and making sure that your waste streams are being recovered and utilized as a new input. So we're seeing across each of those kind of 5 segments opportunities for that carbon value add and impact, as well as some kind of operational efficiency gain.
Yeah, and both of you sort of have, I would call it, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think, a lot of your expertise in this area of sustainability is particularly in supply chain, and sort of how to make supply chains, more efficient and more sustainable across their life cycle. I'm curious, and we touched on this a little bit, but what are the biggest challenges that startups have today trying to innovate in these areas? Like, what should startups know if there are people in the audience who are trying to build a business focused around supply chain, wanting to obviously work with large companies as they're integrating? That's such a broad question, but if you could sort of offer your wisdom to the entrepreneurs in the room who are listening, as they aim to build their business and try to land their first pilot or two. What are the pieces? And Danielle, you said earlier a little bit about don't try to move too fast till you have product market fit. But what else is out there that you see founders sort of either making mistakes around, or that you see some people who've done something really well and you're like, wow, I wish more startups would follow that path?
Yeah, I mean, I think Techstars actually does a great job of this in the cohorts, at least that I've seen. But spend a lot of time with your customers, or who you think your customers are, and recognizing that value, what your value proposition actually is. I don't think you can do too many customer interviews before you even spend money launching your product or building out your solution. The best companies that we've seen are the ones that actually sit on the factory floor, sit with their potential users, understand their existing workflows, and then build their product or solution around that. And that's, that goes into product market fit. It doesn't cost any money, right? So there's no excuse for any founder to not have done that by the time they're looking to raise capital. And then I think the other really important thing is recognizing what your ROI is going to be for that end customer. So if there is some kind of implementation cost, what's the payback period? And obviously it's not going to be right on day one of you building your product, but you should have a sense of what that looks like. You can pencil it out. Again, after spending enough time with your customers, you should be able to figure that out. And it all gets wrapped up into the value proposition that you're providing.
Right, and to jump on that thought, right? Many years ago, I saw a chart that always sticks with me, but it's basically, you need to convert your sustainability story into one of these 4 buckets, and imagine short-term and long-term, and additional revenue or reduction of cost on the left side. So you either have an improved revenue, a cost reduction on the short-term side that's very easily calculatable. Everyone knows how to do that. And the longer term stuff's a little bit harder to convert to dollar amounts, but you've got basically brand reputation improvement, employee retention, sort of in the positive long term. And then in the cost savings long term, you have risk mitigation, right? We exited bad materials early. Now we're not spending a ton of money doing a fire drill, or we are preventing an issue before it happens, right? So again, everyone knows, even if sustainability wasn't included, those 2 longer term ones are always harder sells, but the more you can put data around it and justify it, the better.
That's awesome.
The one other thing that I would add to that, Dan, I love that point. The one other thing I'd say is a lot of entrepreneurs that we see who are, come from sustainability, or they're thinking about this from an impact perspective. There's a tendency to get overexcited about fixing all the problems all at once. And I think, especially if you're coming into the manufacturing space, you have to be really focused about solving one problem at a time. You could have a game plan to tackle everything later on, but focusing on one core problem first is really important also.
Super interesting. I love that breakdown, is really helpful. And I'm curious, similarly, for folks in the room who work at large companies that are trying to work with startups in this area, what advice do you have for them? Like, where do you see large companies doing great things in terms of trying to engage startups, trying to help them, guide them, give them the right types of feedback? And where have you seen large companies, with all the best intentions in the world, doing things that are detrimental to startups? Again, particularly in the notion of companies trying to work on sustainable solutions.
Yeah, so I'll touch on a detriment to start. And again, it just is, it's legacy, right? The way we have treated plastics has been, we want well-established suppliers. We're kind of the second tier behind automotive, right? We don't want to deviate too much from what they're using because there's a ton of volume behind it, right? And we almost, treated, it's commodity based, right? Who can deliver the function at the lowest price, right? Sort of strict entry points, right? You got to prove that you can color match and do all these things before we even start trialing it, right? Sort of just to make sure you're serious, but that kind of sort of entryway doesn't work for startups, right? They don't have all the resources to be able to do that. So, as you start to get deeper, I think a modification of that process is going to be needed to take on new and novel materials, right? But so that's one thing I've noticed particularly is, it's just a change in how we're doing things, though, right? So.
Yeah, and for the large companies who are listening in, I think there's one kind of easy way from my perspective, probably hard for you guys, but is try to work with the companies as they scale, right? A startup on day one isn't going to be able to provide you with all of the materials that you need for some production batch, but Whole Foods did a really great job of this in helping to scale small brands where they would say, okay, well, you can pilot in this one store, and then we'll scale you regionally, and then we'll scale you nationally. If there's a way that a manufacturing company could do something similar, that would be enormously helpful for early stage.
Right. And I do believe there is a way, because we'll start with, maybe a small group, 3 products that works. Then next step, okay, expand and expand. I just think maybe, getting through the door, right? We had the bar set a little too high, right? And we're trying to push startups through the same sort of pre-qual, right? And so we learned, hey, you can't do that, right? You got to revise it,
Yeah, and actually, maybe that's a question for you, Dan. For some of the new, let's say, materials that you're looking for, are you publicly publishing those specifications of what you might need? Because part of this is sending the right market signals.
Yeah, so I guess we're not publicly publishing, but pretty much we could probably just publish the pie chart of the plastics we buy, right? Because it would be a mixture of, you don't even have to get to supplier. You could say we buy ABS, polypropylene, PCABS. You could just list them very generically and say, you have sustainability alternatives for this, right? And can you color them, right? And can they meet flammability and insulation resistance, right? So you kind of lay that out. But yeah, I don't think we've publicly posted that, but we could for sure. And I think when we start to engage with a supplier for a startup, we do give them that and say, here's what we're using. Here are the technical specs. Can your stuff match this, right?
Right.
Your comments on Whole Foods process is really interesting, because what it's obviously harder to do if you're making a product line and you're trying to ship that product line, across a global SKU. But I wonder, the software industry has long had sort of opt-in beta programs where you can opt in to the beta version of Gmail or whatever that is. And I wonder if there's something like that in manufacturing that could become a thing where, a large product company enables people to buy essentially a test product. And I don't know, it'd be you'd have to build a whole reward structure or something around it. Like, what would be the reason for opting in? But it seems like that could be an interesting thing. I don't know that I've seen it. I don't know, Danielle or Dan, if you've seen anyone try that, but.
I've seen it in the consumer product, like consumer packaged goods industry, where you have, not necessarily through a major brand, but you have aggregators that are effectively doing A/B testing on behalf of early stage startups and kind of packaging groups of new products for consumers. I don't know how that could really be applied in the manufacturing, larger scale manufacturing space, but maybe something similar. I like that idea, Cody.
Yeah, maybe something like, I've seen some cool people out there, take our products, like for example, a string trimmer. And you know how on the bottom of a string trimmer, you have the cap that holds the spool in so somebody was frustrated about moss or like kind of flat weeds in their garden beds. They created a kind of this cap that had nodules on it, right? That would basically scrape that away and uploaded it to be 3D printed. And so, that's really cool, right? And so like I could see, as 3D printers expand more, maybe new kind of either an open source where people can upload their stuff, or we can try and say, what do you think of this? How did that work, right? You can print it essentially for free minus the material. And if it works, it's a benefit. If not, they can complain about it, and that's how you learn, right? But
yeah, and you could even in that case, maybe you could even let people opt into different feedstocks in terms of what's feeding the 3D printer, right? So you could try out a new bioplastic or something through the 3D printer feedstock that you're using in this distributed, hardware beta future world. It seems like that's where things are heading. Back to Danielle, you were talking about like, how do you get to more distributed manufacturing, right? So instead of having, 3 production facilities on 3 continents, you end up with lots of smaller local production facilities that reduce the need for transport, can allow consumers to buy individualized upgrades to whatever equipment they're looking to get. Like, that feels like where the world is headed, and unless I'm just living in startup utopia land, I don't know.
No, that's where I think it's headed. I know, I think Parsimony was speaking earlier today. They're doing something like that. And I think, there's this conception of distributed manufacturing. It doesn't have to be all 3D printing, right? It doesn't have to be that, right? It could just be, exactly to your point, Cody, existing manufacturers that are just more local. And we've spoken with Stanley Black Decker about this. We've spoken with other companies that I think highlighted the need for more localized supply chains and some redundancy in supply chains, right? We don't need to always be optimizing for just in time because disasters and unforeseen events are going to happen. Yeah.
Well, on that note, let's maybe pivot into some of the lessons learned from COVID, because that's obviously highly related. What have you seen, particularly when it relates to, we kind of all have talked over and over again about the manufacturing response and supply chain impacts of COVID. I think that's a fairly still new, but very studied field at this point. But what in particular for companies that are building more sustainable solutions have you seen arise due to the awareness of the need for greater supply chain resiliency? Like, are there any lessons for entrepreneurs working on either alternative materials or, back to your earlier points on just general traceability software and things like that, that you think are direct sort of, knee-jerk's the wrong word, but direct responses to some of the issues over the last 12 months?
I'll let you go first, Danielle, if you want, or I can. It's up to you.
No, I'll take it if you want. So I think what I just mentioned is, this trend towards shorter supply chains, right? I think we saw with really long global supply chains, there's a lot of brittleness there. If you can't get, this one part from Indonesia to, Vietnam for whatever reason, like that totally warps your supply chain and your ability to provide goods to your customers who are demanding it. So I think having shorter supply chains is one really important feature. Having some redundancy, and then also having renewable feedstocks. And Dan, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but if your feedstocks are local to your manufacturers and to your customers, there's a greater potential for you to be able to provide those products. We saw that during COVID, there were some CPG companies who had manufacturing in the US. They saw a tremendous growth in the demand for their products, and they were able to service that demand versus companies that had more globalized supply chains. And so that's really important, and definitely a trend that we're seeing from that material side, and plays into the idea of recycled content as being a great source of feedstocks for many processes as well.
Yeah, and I'd say, kind of on the flip side around what did we learn from a product perspective from COVID and sort of just having a big societal need dropped on everyone around the world at the same time? So starkly different than climate change, which has been so slow moving and people questioning it. Oh, it's cold this year. Is it real? and this hit, right? And other articles basically saying, if we don't do something about it, you can expect this like every 3 years or so until, So my hope is that there's some long-term memory of this for us, that we don't just go right back to normal. But I was very proud of our agility when this started, right? Of being able to shift. Like we had a startup within Techstars called DGP, who was originally bio-based bar chain oil and motor oils and hydraulic fluids. And they pivoted in the middle of this, did hand sanitizer, and we had a Stanley version of hand sanitizer for a little bit to kind of fill a gap. That's not our core. We're going to exit it, right? Because, we're not in the hand sanitizer business, but in the short term, right, helping to fill that. Or, temporary access for a air-powered respirator with Ford and 3M, right? So it really brought out a lot of collaboration and, I don't know, a lot of good human spirit, if you will, right? And I just thought it was amazing how everyone kind of just shifted for the good, and we were able to respond, And with the supply chain, we had a couple of losses of suppliers for waste streams that took some of our zero waste to landfill sites off being zero waste to landfill. But again, it teaches us, longer term. Maybe we were a little too local there or too small. Maybe we need a little bit, So I don't know if that exactly answered your question, but
oh, for sure. Yeah, and I think maybe just I'm sort of shifting gears a little bit from obviously that topic, but I want to talk about packaging because I feel like packaging is such a crucial part of the waste problem. And there is so much innovation happening in green materials today, particularly around plastics packaging, but clearly in other areas of it too. What if a startup is working on a new packaging solution, different from working on sort of core products? Are the unit economics of how they should think about what they're working on differently? Like there may be a little less critical in the core production flow or not, I don't know. Like I'd love to hear your thinking about how they need to approach business development, how they need to approach seeking a pilot. It feels like, it's different to say I have a swap out for the main plastic component of your core product versus like, hey, here's an alternative way you could package your product to create less waste. Like, how do those dynamics play out for startups that are innovating in this area?
So I guess we're deep in this. So I have, a couple of hopefully nuggets for people so for first and foremost is it's not totally our decision, as Stanley Black Decker, where we are in the supply chain, right? Because we work with customers, whether that be an Amazon, a Lowe's, a Depot, a Menards, right? All sorts of retailers. And they have point of sale setups and stuff that we need to fit into or negotiate with, right? So it's not even solely a matter of if you convince us, we'll use it and you're good to go. You got to convince another step down the chain, right? And secondly, I think there are there's some proof that needs to go on in terms of, there's still a lot of belief, I think, that you have to see the product through the package, right? That you won't sell it if they can't see what's in it, right? There's some distrust or something. And it blows my mind considering how much I order from Amazon because I buy stuff sight unseen all the time. But again, plastic, one of its benefits is it's clear and transparent, right? And so it's not used because we love plastic, it's used because you can see through it. But if we proved basically that a good image is good enough, right? Everything could go to paper-based at least, right? And then we could work on managing the sustainable forestry and using a rapidly renewable material. But so I guess those are two big things: is try to dispel maybe common myths that people are going to say, nope, they got to see it, right? And you say, well, no, actually, we did some work, or we came together as the sustainable packaging startups and hired somebody to do research to say that's wrong, or find ways to make rapidly renewable materials clear if you don't want to try to fight that. But there's just all these little wrinkles of it that's shocking.
Dan, do you think it's on the startup to have to do that work on kind of packaging consumer research?
Maybe if they wanted to sell quicker, right? Because if it comes to us, right, and our marketing folks say no because they can't see it, and we're not going to risk revenue for it.
Yeah.
And it works, right?
Dan,
The problem is when you're trying to drive change, you got to put way more effort in to move it, right?
Totally agree.
Because everyone just wants to stay where they're at.
Yeah, you got to be the expert in your market for sure. Absolutely, 100% agree.
And I think it's interesting, Dan, to hear that perspective on the marketing side, because we have a number of sustainable packaging companies come pitch us. And one of the things that we think about often is, what is the purpose of packaging in this context? For you, I could understand it's the marketing. For food, it's often for preserving freshness. For multiple other products, it's making sure that there's not physical damage to the product. And so each of those use cases, it requires kind of a different set of needs. It's properties of the material itself, which influences how likely you are to actually solve for that problem. In a lot of those cases, you know, if it's just to preserve freshness, for example, there are alternatives that are coming onto the market for food products like Mori, for example, that can just reduce the need for packaging overall, and that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at something that's preventing physical damage, maybe there's an opportunity for reuse of packaging. Maybe you could have some kind of more structured, reusable packaging that surrounds your product. That would then have to fit into some kind of reverse logistics flow. That could be really effective. We invested in a company called Algramo that does this for consumer packaged goods, like for home care and cleaning products, right? Or maybe the most optimal thing, if you need something that is disposable, is that you're designing that packaging to be fully recyclable or compostable at the end of its life. And so that goes into the design conversation. But the most important takeaway, I think, is that you're trying to fit the packaging to the use case of whoever you're trying to sell to.
Right.
You know, we've seen.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead. We've seen clear bioavailable plastic alternatives like nanocellulosics, for example, that can provide clear, a kind of clear plastic-like sheet. But, you know, does that easily fit into your existing manufacturing process for your packaging is another question, or how much strain does it need to be resistant to for your packaging? So all of those are important questions. If anyone's interested, I'll put in a plug. We just put out a report on biopolymers. It's available on the Closed Loop Partners website. So if you want to understand the space of alternatives to plastics in greater depth, that's a publicly available report for you.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, just one other. So we are part of Element Author Commitment. Again, though, that is recyclability, reusability, compostability. Within that, our marketing teams still have discretion, right? As long as they're meeting that. So you know, again, just another thing. If you've got an idea that the assembly of it or the actual packaging on the line is more automated, right, than the previous. Another way we've been able to do things is basically if something costs a little more, you can offset that through an operational efficiency, right? So at the end of the day, it looks cost neutral and you've made an improvement. So I keep that in mind too, is if you're able to basically, not just the material itself, but the cost of packaging it within it, right? If you can reduce that, that'll help you sell it better.
Awesome. All right, I want to hit on one more kind of meta topic, which is just generally the circular economy. And so, you know, Danielle, I would love for you to just walk us through briefly, you know, sort of the 101 of how a circular economy, how the feedstock economy works from a circularity perspective. And, you know, in particular, I see startups pitching, you know, sort of closed loop systems where they help take waste from one industry and turn it into a feedstock in that industry. And I see other startups pitching, taking feedstock from one industry and taking it to a totally different supply chain somewhere else. And I'm curious sort of the distinctions between the two, which one you think is easier, harder, sort of, but just generally walking through the sort of what I would call the closed loop economy.
Yeah, and that's an important topic and a broad one. So I'll take your direction so far. You know, when we think about the circular economy, it is, Cody, exactly to your point, taking one waste feedstock and converting it into something of higher value. That can be within a single industry, it could be within a single factory, right? Where you're taking offcuts and of aluminum, for example, and then reusing them in your existing process, or you are taking something and transferring it to another industry. We'll also look at everything from, maybe it's a new material stream, maybe it's not a current waste stream, but it's a better renewable stream that can feed into that existing process. Or like I mentioned before, it's part of the design integration, or something about the business model that's creating less waste in the entire supply chain. One of the things that is often overlooked when you're thinking about creating those circular business models are the logistics and how much a product needs to move. So in answer to your question, Cody, how do you think about those different models? The cost of logistics and transportation in recycling, for example, is one of the highest cost components to that entire system. So to the extent that you can minimize the distance traveled, the better your economics are going to be for any kind of recycled output that you have. I think the same is true for pretty much any manufacturing process. So if you can create an entirely closed loop system on site to an existing manufacturing process, or co-locate, so you have, the Stanley Black Decker manufacturing facility, and the next company that's going to take your waste streams and create something of higher value from that in a kind of eco-industrial park, that's an optimal scenario. So I think that when we think about circular economy, we're thinking not just about how good is that product or that service that some company is providing, but also what is the logistics infrastructure that's necessary in order to service that. It's one of the reasons why Closed Loop Partners actually has not just the venture investing arm, which is in the early stage companies, but also infrastructure investing arm, private equity investing arm, so that we can build out the infrastructure at the same time as we're supporting the innovative companies that are going to utilize that infrastructure.
Super interesting. Well. I mean, it's interesting comparing, the U.S. to a market like China, where a lot of manufacturing happens in these like multi-square mile industrial parks, where the material logistics is actually much easier. In the U.S. and in a lot of Europe, I don't think we have that luxury, right? The logistics and transportation, you're right, becomes a much bigger consideration. Dan, I'm curious, for you all at Stanley Black & Decker, what does it take for you to, if a startup is pitching you on, hey, we can take one of your waste streams that you're not using today and help you monetize it? How do you think about that? Like, that's a whole new business line for you, quote unquote. Like, does that become a thing you have to build an entire business case around internally? Or is that an area where it's easy to run a little quick pilot and see how it works?
I think that the way our sites operate that are generating significant amounts of waste, so I'm going to ignore like office buildings with food waste. We're talking manufacturing and distribution, right? A lot of them managed locally, right? So they're trying to find local, the best and most efficient way to get rid of, to do it right, zero waste to landfill. But, and again, like if their task is zero waste to landfill, they might say, oh, as long as someone takes it to recycle it, right? I'm happy. But I do believe there's opportunity there for being a little more strategic about it, right? In terms of sort of a corporate view of what is all of our waste, what is all of our assets, right? And like, okay, well, we're doing a lot of stuff here and we're creating a lot of stuff here. And this is a really hard waste, but a similar process is this. Why don't we do that instead of that? So we're not creating that waste. I mean, I don't think that it's as systemized as that. It's more or less people kind of, okay, here's my site and here's what I got to do, right? And then, so those site operators too, sometimes don't have all the control because the engineers are saying what the product is, right? And they're just receiving the design based on that. So it even has to take a step back to, like in your CAD system, when you're designing a part and saying, hey, I want it to have this right angle, it should say, hey, wait a minute, that's going to be an energy intensive process, going to be a lot of waste. Yeah. You might want to move that to 87 degrees, right? That's the intelligence, right? That will really change it, right? And that's a ton of work, but that to me is like the Jetsons' future is, as you're designing something, it's basically giving you all your warnings about, well, if you do this, it's that. If you do this, it's that, right? And you have to optimize, based on that.
I love it. So. Well, listen, we've got 1 minute left. So with, first of all, I want to thank you both for joining, taking your time to share insights with us and with the people who are listening in. I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining. And then Dan and Danielle, if you each have sort of one final piece of advice or prediction on what is, what big thing is going to happen over the next year. Either one you want to give, a piece of advice to startups or a big prediction on what's coming next. Take 20 seconds each and do that.
I can go first.
Great.
Go ahead, Danielle.
So I think, honestly, I've been super impressed with this conference so far, hearing everyone talk about circularity. I think I'm often in my own little world thinking that most other folks aren't thinking about circularity in supply chains. And so I think the fact that we're just seeing so much talk about it, not just at this conference, but also in other industry, I think in the next 5 years, we're going to start to see a lot more of that optimized manufacturing, maybe some industrial eco parks where those circular supply chains are really showcased. And I think that's going to be a driver of kind of what the future of industry and the future of manufacturing is going to look like.
Yeah, and I just, from direct experience, but, other things I've read, sustainability is being pulled on a lot. Right? I can't keep up with email and people requesting information on this and that. So just in my own little world, seeing how much it's ramped up since COVID started, right? I feel like that means a lot of opportunity is going to be available for you startups, and there'll be a lot of reception on the corporate side to your ideas and what you can do, and helping do better, right? So I hope the interest skyrockets for you, so you have way more meetings and calls.
Awesome. Well, Dan and Danielle, thank you very much. Folks, also be on the lookout from Techstars. We have, this has been our manufacturing summit. We have a Techstars Sustainability Summit coming up on April 15th. We haven't fully announced it yet, but everyone here, if you're opted into our email systems, should get an invitation. It's going to be open to the web. We want as many people to join as possible. It's going to be a really fantastic event, and we'll announce the winners of our Techstars Sustainability Challenge at that event as well. Thank you for your interest in sustainable manufacturing today, and look forward to future conversations.